When I first heard that shackling was still happening in Maryland, the first thing that occurred to me was where this practice sits within the larger, the broader historical and even substantive range of civil rights abuses. So here it is, we have women, largely women of color, women from low-wage earning communities who have been historically marginalized, much like other communities who have experienced civil rights abuses. And so to me, it was really a no-brainer that this is really the reproductive rights, the civil rights issue that is most relevant for the female prison population.
Every year we heard stories of women giving birth in the facilities. Many times they were sharing their remorse that they couldn't hold their child because they were shackled. They talked about the fear of what was going to happen to their child when their child was out of their custody, because the children are taken from them. They don't get to spend much time with the child. And then they would also share that they were shackled. So the physical experience of shackling was, very painful, but the psychological damage of being shackled, having it be surrounded by the fear for their child and the grief and pain that they were experiencing, around giving birth while incarcerated, added to it.
One of the women was just talking about being transported to court and observing that a woman who was pregnant was restrained, was shackled, and that she was having a difficult time. And I said, well, wait a minute, what do you mean, shackled? And she said, well, the woman was pregnant, was well beyond 6 months pregnant. There was a chain around her stomach, and she couldn't bend over. She had her wrists were restrained, and I was horrified. I had no idea that we were still doing that. I thought, well, I'll draft a bill, and I would have to say that I thought I just thought this would be easy. I did a little research. We looked at the California bill. We looked at some of the other bills and drew features from all the different bills and put together what I thought was a piece of legislation that would address as many of the issues as possible. And then I filed it. And again, working closely with Jackie Robarge of Power Inside, working closely with the ACLU, and we put it in. And then the fun started, because again, I was not anticipating opposition.
The questions and the feedback that we get from legislators and also from members of the public tend to be concerned with the safety of the prison guards and also the risk of escape. So it was important for us to, right off the bat, point out what may otherwise seem obvious, but the limited mobility that women experience, not only during pregnancy, but particularly during labor. And so the risk of escape is really inconsequential at that point. And so there is really no need to shackle women. So issues like that, logistical issues, were the matters that were raised by the legislators, and so we had to really be prepared to respond to those sort of queries that they might have.
You have these systems that were set up with men in mind. I mean, it goes to, our basic civil right of voting was set up and organized for white males who own property, and we have spent hundreds of years attempting to undo that. And so equally, we have all these institutions, whether it's the practice of restraining prisoners, which had everything to do with violent male offenders, that there had not been any type of reasonable accommodation, which is the language that I started to use, that there was no reasonable accommodation made for women.
If we draw an image of who is being shackled, generally we're thinking about Black and brown women. And as long as that is what people are giving permission to do, is to shackle Black women during childbirth, we're okay with that because in this culture, we can do anything to Black women's bodies. There are many ways that Black women are under attack.
I have to say that what was most remarkable in the testimony and in the opposition to the bill was this notion that these women, because they had been accused or had committed a crime, that therefore anything that happened to them was their fault, and that anything could happen to them. And that I even had people say, well, you know, if she knew she was pregnant, she shouldn't have committed the crime, or she should have thought about that ahead of time. And what was startling and I guess offensive for me was the degree to which we were willing, people who I thought were compassionate folks, people who I would not identify as conservative, had this willingness to dehumanize these women because they were in the prison.
It's a process to really bring the voices of the women in prison who are largely invisible from society. Actually, well, they're literally invisible from society because most of us do not walk through the halls of prisons every day. So to bring those voices to the legislators, not only in a way that sort of connects the logical dots to show why shackling women is bad policy, but also in an emotional way to really bring the spirit of these women who have been really broken in so many ways, but particularly with shackling, to bring that experience to legislators is really a little bit challenging, especially when it can be very re-traumatizing for women to have to testify in front of a public audience. Not just the legislators, but the entire public is there to watch, to describe this very personal and dehumanizing experience.
As they recounted the stories, whether it was 3 years ago or almost 20 years ago, there was a woman who testified in writing, and she cried about experiences that she had almost 20 years ago. I mean, and she remembers every detail, what people said, the expressions on people's faces, where she felt pain, and it was just, the more testimonies I took, the more I was convinced that this is one of the greatest harms of shackling is the long-term trauma.
Legislators are not often within the walls of prisoners, so to really humanize women and remind legislators and the public that these are first women, or even before that, before being prisoners, they are patients, they're medical patients with serious medical needs. And before being patients, they're women. And before being women, they are humans, just like the rest of us. And so the basic human response that we should have should be one of compassion. It should be. Regardless of what offense a woman has committed, you know, before going into prison, or that has caused her to find herself incarcerated, that really should not have any bearing on whether or not we decide to commit this very inhumane practice of shackling someone during labor.
Our goal is not only about passing the bill. Our goal is about culture shift and wanting this to be a more peaceful and less violent world. And shackling is a very violent process enacted by the state.
It's not just a woman's issue. This really is, it's a civil rights issue and it's a human rights issue. The way we are treating our most vulnerable population, not only because they're in prison, but because they're women and because they are pregnant. And so, you know, the way we treat these women is not only a woman's issue, because it's indicative really of how we are treating all our prisoners and all our marginalized communities, many of whom are intersecting populations. You know, we have people of color, women of color, poor people, and people who are imprisoned. And, you know, unfortunately, there is substantial overlap between all those demographics.
And why I'm still so committed that even if it happens to 1 woman a year or 2 women a year, how long have we been doing this? How many women have given birth in prisons and jails and psychiatric hospitals? If you go back into our history of institutionalization, this type of restraint on women is not uncommon. And so we're talking a century of restraining and harming and traumatizing women during childbirth.